podcast. Is this now up? Are we live? Do we know what's going on? Not entirely certain. Video's just missing. Audio's just missing. Boomer. Yeah, that's fair. I agree. This is very boomer of me. Why is there no audio here? This is disturbing. Is there no... So I'm apparently streaming, but there's no... Is that going to help? Probably not. Video capture. What is going on? Well, there is audio and no video, but I don't think that's... I think audio is part of the experience. What is... Oh man, I apologize deeply about this. Not entirely certain what's going on. Can we edit this? No. Yes, the video is not working. We are aware. I am trying to figure out what I have done here. I think... Yes, I have an open source alternative. I have attempted to download the open source alternative, and it is streaming audio, but it is not streaming video, which is a real problem for me. I'm going to try to end this stream and then restart it. Maybe that'll work. I don't know. Apologies. Okay, that stream is over. That was terrible. Okay, this is live now. Connecting streaming software. Okay. This is live. Is anybody watching it? Okay, this is working. Oh dear me. Well, I appear to have not many views. I have an excellent connection. That's lovely, I guess. Oh, my category is gaming. That's certainly not it. Okay, back. Okay, people are here. People are watching, apparently. I don't quite understand what's happening, but, I mean, is it on here as well? No, I think that is just a mess. That is over and done. Okay, we've got an Ethiopia live stream. We're doing it. There are 14 people watching. So I guess I'm gonna just go ahead and get down to it. I'm gonna start streaming on TikTok as well. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. We are trying out something new here. We are on a new kind of streaming platform that will hopefully work better. Apologies for the mess at the beginning here. Today we are discussing Ethiopia. For those of you who are new here, I want to point out that for live streaming, what happens is I do a bit of a presentation for 45 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes, and then I dive into the live chat. And it is on the live chat that I will answer any questions that you may or may not have. The live chat goes on the entire time, of course, and we will all participate. There are a few ground rules. You can say whatever you want to say about me. You can say anything you want to say about my ideas. We're very open-minded about what you say about the issues we discuss. We do have a sort of entirely at our own discretion limitation. We really don't like people to engage in sort of semi-genocidal conversation. And unfortunately with Ethiopia, this is an issue that might come up. So yeah, with that rather small limitation that we don't want anybody to engage in openly genocidal conversation, you're allowed to say pretty much everything you want, and you have to be civil to other people in the live chat. You are not allowed to attack other people in the chat. Logo Cool Extreme is our moderator. If he tells you that you are acting out of turn, listen to him. If you do not, he will block you. There is no what's the word I'm looking for? There is no appeal from the court of Logo. So listen to what he has to say. I just want to, I may seem a little discombobulated. I'm dealing with a new piece of streaming software that is more complicated and I do not understand. If you've found me, I'm grateful because there was a bit of weirdness at the launch. I can't see myself in real time the way that I used to be able to on live streaming platforms. So I'm a little discombobulated. So bear with me. Because what we're discussing today is fiendishly interesting stuff. It is the fact that the United States government is now actively looking for ways to get involved in the world, get more involved in the world. In the aftermath of the Afghanistan disaster, well, I mean, the first good decision the United States government had made on Afghanistan in 20 years, getting the heck out of there. We have a Pentagon, a military-industrial complex, and a foreign policy establishment that is absolutely desperate to find anything to do. This can be, shown in ridiculous ways, like, oh, we got to get worried about UFOs now, or, ooh, China's got a nuclear weapons technology that the U.S. and the Russians have had for 60 years. We got to get really scared about that. But on Thursday, the Thursday of last week, I saw something that's really, really dangerous, which is a highly respected retired U.S. admiral, public figure, probably one of the more prominent retired five-star general figures I'm aware of, James Stavridis, I apologize, I think I mispronounced his last name, in Bloomberg suggested that it would be appropriate for the United States, for U.S. troops to get involved in the conflict in Ethiopia. I find this outrageous. I obviously don't have the appropriate qualifications to talk about Ethiopia as an expert, but I'm a YouTuber. I don't have the qualifications to speak about any of the things that I speak about. All I promise is that I do a better job discussing these issues than any cable news channel. And on Ethiopia, I have been doing the homework over the past month or so. I've been reading the books. I have been, diving into the reports. And I gotta say that this article in Bloomberg by Stavridis is one of the more outrageously irresponsible things I think I have ever seen. It's truly mind-boggling that we're at a point where we would consider getting involved in this conflict. I've been drafting a number of scripts on the conflict in Ethiopia, and one of the things that I'm most settled about was I was actually sort of saying to myself, it's actually as horrific as what is going on in Ethiopia is right now, and it is horrific. It's actually kind of refreshing from the context of a U.S. A U.S. citizen, somebody who feels a great deal of shame about the amount of death and destruction that my country has unleashed over the past 20 years. It's actually kind of refreshing that in Ethiopia, what we're seeing is a large-scale conflict that has almost nothing to do with the United States. Every other major death, I mean, South Sudan, yeah, that's pretty much our fault too, but almost every major death event of the 21st century is either directly caused by the United States or the United States is intimately involved with it, deeply involved in it. So honestly, for me, before this past Thursday, I found the Ethiopia conflict kind of refreshing in that, like, it's not my fault. It is not unlike almost every other death by violence in the 21st century, what's happening in Ethiopia right now is not my fault as a U.S. taxpayer. And I like that. And I mean, obviously, I want the killing in Ethiopia to stop. I have firm opinions on that. I think that the whole world, including the U.S. diplomatic corps should be involved in stopping what's going on in Ethiopia. But this idea that U.S. troops should be involved is just insane. It's like the Pentagon and the U.S. foreign policy establishment are completists. It's like, oh, we saw a conflict somewhere. We saw a conflict somewhere where we're not almost entirely to blame for everybody dying. We'd like to get in there. And that I think that should give an indication of how disturbing I found Admiral Stavridis's intervention, in the public conversation and suggestion that that the United States should get involved in Ethiopia. It was just like really, really troubling to me. Admiral Stavridis is actually someone, I don't respect his ideas, but I think I do have some respect for the guy because he didn't have to. Unlike almost all sort of retired, I think you call them 5 stars. I may be incorrect about that, but folks who are 4 stars, right? Like folks who reached a certain level in the military, made it all the way through, made it, still in the military in their 60s, 50s and 60s as officers. I mean, these are guys who could just literally, and almost all of them, there was a study, sadly not a recent study, but almost all of them just walked directly into $1 million annual paychecks, maybe not $1 million, but hundreds of thousands of dollars annual paychecks, working for defense companies to sell things to the people that used to work for them in the military. Like that's what almost all of them do. And I have some respect, certainly more respect for Stavridis, who seems like a more honest actor than, say, like H.R. McMaster. But like I do have some respect for these figures who really have no incentive to get involved in public conversation at all. And I think that this Stavridis guy probably has some respect for the idea of democracy and defending his ideas. His ideas are terrible. I wrote a review of his book. You guys might be aware, if you're into geopolitics, of his 2034 book, sort of a fantasy of war between the U.S. and China. My review was not kind. I've got that linked in the description. But I think it is actually commendable. Before I spend the rest of the presentation ripping him to shreds, I think it is commendable that a person with the instant easy payday that he had as somebody who had retired at the top of the military, he actually chose to become a somewhat public figure instead and actually engage with this sort of thing. But that said, it's I think what's going on with this article is that it's not fully serious. I think that what this is a trial balloon. It's an article that he wrote, and it's linked in the description below. Sort of my intention in signing up for this studio OBS thing was to be able to maybe find a way to show the the article as I went through it, but I didn't figure out how to do it, so this is all a mess. But it is linked below, and I think what this article is sort of a trial balloon. It's an attempt, by Stavridis personally, by businesses he may represent. It's an attempt to just see what happens. What happens if we, in Bloomberg, a fairly serious publication, what if we just put out this article saying, yeah, the U.S. should put troops in Ethiopia? Why don't we just see how that goes? It would be, why don't we just see how that goes? And the idea is to see, well, what is the reaction? And honestly, I don't think there has been much reaction, even among the kinds of people I follow on Twitter. They all seem a lot more engaged in Ann Applebaum's ridiculously stupid Atlantic story on dictators, which is something I may cover at some other point on the channel. And nobody's really paying much attention to this Stavridis article, other than to be like, wow, that's really stupid. But I think I think that's a mistake because I think that this Stavridis article is much more dangerous than whatever standard intellectual masturbation over the dictators and rising authoritarianism we're getting on places like the Atlantic and that Ann Applebaum article. This is an actual suggestion from a highly ranked, fairly well respected, retired admiral that the United States get involved in Ethiopia. It is insane. There needs to be more pushback against this. It's what I'm doing with this live chat and what I will be doing with some produced videos later on. So what is going on in Ethiopia? Some of you may ask. Well, of course, this is difficult to find out, but I think it's possible because everything here is just possible. We're talking about there's been a really intense media blackout in Ethiopia since the start of this conflict in November of 2020. To put it very simply, Abiy Ahmed, the previously much admired Nobel Peace Prize winning Prime Minister of Ethiopia, launched an invasion of Tigray, a small section of Ethiopia with 6 million out of Ethiopia's 110 million inhabitants, launched this invasion in November of 2020 around the U.S. election. I think he had a number of sort of political plans and ideas behind this. I think it's important. There's sort of layers of illusion with this conflict. I think the Tigrayans were absolutely the victims of a genocidal campaign, not just from the Ethiopian central government, but also from the Eritreans, a separate country to the north, in combination with the Ethiopian government invaded Tigray. However, it's important to point out, as became very, very clear in June of 2021, that these Tigrayans are not meek victims. They are, in fact, the people who ran the country between 1991 and 2018, and they have pushed back, and they have pushed back majorly. The most in-depth analysis that I've read, which is probably pretty speculative. To be clear, I've read a lot of analysis of this, is a sort of speculative coverage by a guy, and it's a Radio War Nerd, which is a podcast that I follow. I think it's very speculative, but I think there's some truth to his speculation, and I think he's quite clear about the speculation, is that what we could be seeing, what we might have been seeing in Ethiopia over the past year, but not actually, what we might have been not seeing because of the massive media blackout and the general disinterest from international media, what we have been not seeing is quite possibly some of the largest examples of conventional warfare since the Iran-Iraq War. What's going on in Ethiopia is a horrific genocidal war engaged by militias, but it is also a guerrilla campaign of, maybe U.S. and Vietnam style, the Vietnamese army, where you have a sort of very well-resourced and well-organized guerrilla campaign melting away into the forest and coming back, but very well organized and hierarchical. We also have, at the same time, a large conventional war in between very well-resourced and trained militaries. I think folks on Twitter were wondering, I guess it was last week or the week prior, people were like, well, why is, what the hell is going on here? Why are these Tigrayans that we were supposed to be worried about as the victims of genocide now crushing one of the largest and probably most well-funded and experienced militaries in Ethiopia? The Ethiopian military, it's a country of 110 million people. The Ethiopian government has changed its nature and changed hands in really dramatic ways over the past 60 years, going from an empire to a communist dictatorship to a more personal communist dictatorship to the sort of TPLF, the Tigrayan-led ethnic federation, that was sort of I think, very successfully running the country over most of the past 30 years. But during every iteration of that, Ethiopia has been very highly militarized. And those from the Ogaden War in the 70s to the constant fighting that the communist dictatorship was engaged with against the Tigrayans and the Eritreans that eventually overthrew it, to Ethiopia has been a U.S. partner that has been highly involved in, the African Union is headquartered in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, and Ethiopian forces have been a mainstay of U.S. interventions in Somalia, and I think just Somalia, but that's a big deal. It's a very highly experienced, highly bloodied military, and the fact that the Tigrayans just crushed them over the course of seemed to have just crushed that military over the course of 2020 is quite a shock. But what you have to realize is that because it was the Tigrayans running this country for about 20 years, if you sort of take the most decorated, most experienced, highest placed officers of the 2015 Ethiopian military, it's quite possible that a majority of them are now, it's quite possible that a majority of those officers are now working for the Tigrayans, for the Tigrayan Defense Force, for the reformulation of the TPLF, which was the formulation of the Tigrayan militias that was the lead element of the Ethiopian government from 1991 to 2018. So this is a much more complicated conflict than just the genocidal Abiy Ahmed coming in and kicking around the Tigrayans. And while I would never attempt to excuse Abiy Ahmed's actions, I think that his attempt to sort of crush this very real rival to his power, and is being proven to be a very real rival to Abiy Ahmed's power, it complicates the issue a bit, and I think should hopefully add to your understanding. I think what really comes through in the Bloomberg article by Admiral Stavridis that argues for U.S. Intervention in Ethiopia is a deep-seated ignorance of everything I've just laid out there. There's just no concept that Ethiopia might be a more complicated problem than Yugoslavia in the 90s or Rwanda in the 90s. It is an infinitely more complicated problem in an infinitely more powerful and complex place than either Yugoslavia or Rwanda. And the complete lack of awareness about this is just absolutely mind-boggling. Again, Radio Warner points to this a lot. How in the United States, in the Pentagon, in United States conversation more generally, we have this stereotypical image of what warfare in Africa is, formed by the horrors of the Congo and Rwanda. We're envisioning, for those who aren't aware, there was a horrific Rwandan genocide in 1994, largely the result of French funding, in fact. Though after the early days of the genocide, it went from, being carried out with French supplied weapons to being carried out with machetes, and it's some of the more horrifying stuff imaginable. After a French intervention, the Rwandan conflict spilled over into the Congo, launching a really truly horrific war in which 6 million people died, and in the 90s, and that war, I think, formed the U.S. image of what war in Africa is. There were conventional forces in those wars, of course, but it was a lot of militias with machetes running around the jungle. It sort of flatters a lot of racist visions that people in the U.S. might have of Africa and Africa warfare. It just really gross, horrific stuff. And of course, U.S. media plays up the more gross and horrific aspects of that. But that's like the image of African war that is present in the United States, and I think that image, though Stavridis doesn't really engage with those kinds of tropes as much, as what I just said might have suggested. I get the sense that that's probably his vision of what's going on in Ethiopia. Maybe it's something that would be really easy for the U.S. to fix with just a few drones or a few special forces or something like that. And that is not what's going on. As I've said, Radio Warner, it's a podcast and newsletter, has done some really great work just sort of diving into what these wars have looked like, the Ogaden War, the wars between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And it is highly mechanized, World War II looking forces, World War II in Europe looking clashes between mechanized forces with air power, with tanks, with, it's truly, I think, you can lament actually that folks don't, for war nerds more generally, for folks who find conflict interesting, it's sort of a tragedy that there isn't more focus on the conflicts of the Horn of Africa, because these are very complicated, sophisticated military actors. Again, all of these levels of warfare are happening at the same time. You have sophisticated World War II type, generals, mechanized forces, strategy, yada, yada, yada. But as elements of that strategy, you also have, in different phases of the conflict, the Tigrayan Defense Forces was like, let's go full Maoist, let's melt in, or let's go full Viet Cong, let's melt into the territory, and then hit at the right points with guerrilla style tactics. It is also, I think the Tigrayans are using these tactics as well, but I think much more apparently the Ethiopian government is using genocidal militias just as nasty as anything we've seen in the Congo. So all of these things are happening at the same time. It is a tremendously complex conflict, and the idea that the United States could just sort of like waltz in and fix everything because we're America is just mind-bogglingly ignorant and truly disturbing that people are really thinking about this. Again, I don't think this is yet a serious possibility or a serious prospect. This is the marketplace of ideas, and Stavridis is sort of positioning himself. I think it is very likely that we will learn more and more horrific things about the conflict in Ethiopia as more and more information filters out. This is a country of 110 million people. This is a conflict that was previously focused in Tigray, which is of 6 million people, but has now spilled over throughout Amhara and Afar, other regions within Ethiopia. Amhara has 22 million people. There are serious chances that we're already dealing. I think it's probably at the outside at this point, but it's possible that this conflict in Ethiopia has already killed, in a year, more people than the entire Syrian conflict killed in 10 years. That's a possibility. I'm not saying it's a likelihood, but it's possible, and certainly if we get to open warfare in Addis Ababa, it's a very real possibility by the end of the year that in 15 months' time or 14 months' time, Ethiopia could have seen more death and destruction than the entire 10 years of war in Syria. This is something that I harp a lot on the channel, that sort of conventional warfare is potentially vastly more destructive than the sort of civil war insurgent stuff. And the Ethiopian war, there is enough people and enough resources in Ethiopia right now that what's interesting is that another sort of dumb thing about Admiral Stavridis' article is that he sort of holds back from calling this a full-on civil war, which is somewhat ridiculous. Like, the national government's military has been destroyed twice over at this point, and it's not a full-scale civil war. I would say Abiy Ahmed has been put in a worse position now than, arguably in a worse position now than Bashar Assad in Syria ever was, and yet Stavridis is still reluctant to call this a full-on civil war. I think he's right to stress that it could definitely get much worse. It's a country of 110 million, and so far it seems possible that the open fighting has been restrained to regions that include 30 or 40 million people. So yeah, it could get worse, but yeah, this is a full-on civil war. This is a very, very big, complex, nasty deal. So what Stavridis might be doing to position himself here is by putting this article out here that a few people will laugh at, is when we do get the inevitable Amnesty International reports or UN accountings or what have you, we're like, oh my God, the massacres were worse than we thought. There really are, piles of Tigrayan or Amhara, civilians, mass graves everywhere. We now estimate, 500,000 people were killed in this conflict, which is, keep in mind the death toll in Rwanda, the Rwanda genocide that Stavridis quite outrageously references at the end of his article. The death toll in that was 800,000. I think it's entirely imaginable that this Ethiopian conflict, because it does have the hallmarks of a conventional war between states, as well as a civil war, more guerrilla conflict, could potentially kill many more people than were killed in Rwanda by the end of the year. And I think what Stavridis is doing by positioning himself before those revelations start coming out is saying, well, I was for in getting ourselves involved in Ethiopia the whole time, which will, potentially add to his speaking fees or his credibility within, and certainly within the, it doesn't need to be that mercenary, just add to his credibility within the military-industrial complex, to be sort of the leading edge, the first person suggesting that it's time to, the first person to suggest that it's time to get involved, that the U.S. should get involved in this conflict. It's important to point out that there is no plan put forward in Stavridis' article. It is just a list of sort of vague, extraordinarily vague interests that the United States has in Ethiopia that might prompt it to get involved. It's interesting because we're now at a point in the United States with the United States military that the United States is a country of laws. It is a country that is about, its constitution. It is about its attempts and its abilities to. It is about its attempts to run a nation of laws, not a nation of men. It's supposed to be serious. It's supposed to be legally consistent. And when it comes to the U.S. military, it no longer is. Basically, the U.S. military, through a number of authorizations for the use of military force that have been stretched just beyond all imagining, supposedly the United States is involved across the Sahel, across Africa, to deal with terrorism. That's nominally why we're there. There is absolutely no nexus to terrorism in Ethiopia. We've got largely Christian forces versus largely Christian forces engaged with largely Christian enemies. There are Muslims in Ethiopia, but there is no connection I'm aware of to Al Qaeda, to the Islamic State. It's just not there at all, and it's really telling in Stavridis' article when he tries to mention this plausible connection to terrorism. He's like, well, U.S. is doing a lot of anti-terror stuff in Africa. It's a really ludicrous paragraph where he says that Trump pulled us all out from there. We weren't involved in Africa anymore because Trump pulled us out, which is not true. In the last weeks and months and weeks of the Trump administration, there were some scrambled efforts to pull us out of Somalia and to somewhat lessen the presence of special forces training folks in Africa, but I mean, they're all mostly still there. It was a vague attempt at policy by Donald Trump, a guy who was famously incapable of actually bringing any of his policies to fruition. I think one of the funnier, well, more tragic and funny indications we have this year during the Biden administration after Trump, that we very much have a large U.S. presence in Africa was, of course, the Guinea coup. There was a coup in Guinea where the Guinean, I'm sorry, I don't know the appropriate terminology there. The special forces troops in the Guinea military went from directly from U.S. special forces bases where they were getting trained to overthrowing the government. Like they literally did their training with the special forces and hopped in jeeps and overthrew the president. The United States remains offensively involved in African countries. What we're doing, and again, you have to emphasize the extreme variety of governments that are present within Africa. There are a number of countries in the Sahel, sort of the poorest countries on earth, that have had a decade of economic development robbed from them by the U.S. military intervention in Libya, that were also tremendously destabilized by Libya, where, yeah, you can relatively cost-free. I mean, occasionally a bunch of special forces die, and that's, of course, horrible. We probably have many more U.S. paid contractors that are dying. That, too, is horrible. But, you know, relatively low impact on the news, relatively low cost. You can sell a lot of U.S. weapons by putting special forces in there. The government of Ethiopia, the situation in Ethiopia, as I've already described, is very different. This is a much more complex, wealthy, and sophisticated state that is unfortunately falling into a situation of genocide and civil war. But the idea that the United States can just, hop in there and have a positive impact is insane. And yeah, there's no plan here. There's no idea of like what. It's not even clear to me that Stavridis understands what's happening in Ethiopia. He sort of characterizes this as a vicious rebellion, which is, I mean, I guess kinda, but like it's a vicious rebellion in which, the Ethiopian prime minister invaded a section of his own country in cooperation with an outside country, and failed to succeed. I think what's very disturbing, I think that'll probably be what I'll close with eventually, is that what's really disturbing about the vague ideas that I get from the Stavridis article is that it seems to me, while he sort of seems to be even-handed, that what he wants to do, what he's proposing to do here, is to jump in and save Abiy Ahmed. This is the genocidal prime minister who is whose forces were kicked out of Tigray, and now the Tigrayans seem to be marching on the capital. He seems to want to sort of create a sense of stasis here, which would maybe save some lives, but would basically turn Ethiopia into a colony of the United States, in much the same way that Bosnia and Herzegovina and Iraq and no longer Afghanistan sort of became sort of permanent possessions of U.S. empire. That sort of seems to be the goal here, and using Abiy Ahmed as our vessel for that strikes me as really, really horrific. Like, just really, I mean, this is a guy who is absolutely, maybe genocide isn't the appropriate appellation yet, but this is a guy who is absolutely guilty of mass murder. Most importantly, he's guilty of failure. He thought he could get away with demonizing the Tigrayans and creating a nationwide constituency for himself by defeating them. And instead, the Tigrayans, this 7 million out of a population of 110 million, seem to have kicked his ass. So the idea of hopping in to this war, backing up, to double down on backing this guy who is certainly guilty of crimes against humanity, whether or not genocide is the appropriate term, and has lost. He's a loser. And the U.S. Stavridis seems to think we should hop in there and save him by setting up a ceasefire. To be clear, I don't believe that the U.S. government has the capacity anymore, or if it ever did, to impose a settlement on a situation this complicated, this fluid, and this just huge. To do a little bit of comparison, I should have talked about Afghanistan and Iraq, I suppose, because that's the scale of commitment that would be necessary to make any kind of real impact here. But the comparisons that Stavridis reaches for in his article are Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Bosnia, which is a place that I still do believe that in 1995 the U.S. intervention succeeded in saving lives. That's one of the few U.S. interventions where I think it was probably a good thing. And much of the sort of standard mainstream reporting on it seems accurate to me. Bosnia had 4 million people. That's the situation that we, after with much reluctance, agreed to sort of commit to attempting to ameliorate and fix. Rwanda is a situation where the U.S. nobody did much except for the French, who propped up the genocidaires. I don't want to go too in depth to the comparisons between Rwanda and Ethiopia. I believe I have a produced video on that coming out later this week or next week, so I'll talk about that. But Rwanda is definitely something that the U.S. military-industrial complex, the foreign policy establishment, loves focusing on Rwanda, loves talking about how the U.S. should have done more. And yes, in this article where Stavridis makes the case for U.S. involvement in Ethiopia, he name-checks Rwanda. That's actually how he closes the article. Rwanda had 7 million people. Bosnia had 4 million people. In 1994, Rwanda had 7 million people. In 1992, Bosnia had 4 million people. Ethiopia has 110 million people. Tigray, where the fighting is still ongoing, but the Tigrayans seem to have largely won, that's 7 million. Tigray alone, this tiny thumbprint, this tiny postage stamp of territory. I mean, it's massive, massive territory, of course, but in comparison to Ethiopia in general, the fighting is largely finished in that place, this small, tiny part of Ethiopia. That's 7 million people. That's the population of Rwanda. That's almost double the population of Bosnia. You add Amhara, where there is now large-scale fighting. I believe the road to Addis Ababa goes through the Amhara region. That's 20.2 million. Oromia, which is a region that the Tigrayan Defense Forces would have to get through to get to Addis Ababa, that's a region of 35 million. That Oromia alone has 5 times more people than Rwanda did. The extraordinary complexity and difficulty of this task here is something that I don't believe there's been any reckoning with at all. And I think that there used to be this thing called the Powell Doctrine. That was actually, I think, a fairly good idea. I'm not, of course, talking about Colin Powell's later disgrace, being the most credible and positive member of the Bush administration, the most respected. He had a key part in selling the Iraq War. I'm not talking about that. Prior to that, in the era of the first Gulf War in the early 90s, there was the Powell Doctrine. There was this idea that the United States should never get involved in a place unless they had a concrete plan and were able to bring overwhelming force to the table. Neither of those are at all present in this article, in this suggestion that Stavridis makes. There's no reckoning with what is actually going on here. And that's very frustrating. I did have, what finally convinced me to talk about this is, there's a lot of parallels here between what's going on in Yemen and Syria. This is sort of with the launching of the Saudi invasion of Yemen. There was a jump into there was a jump into Yemen because a civil war had ended. Because the Houthis had won the civil war, that is why Saudi Arabia invaded to prop up a government that was mostly resident in Saudi Arabia throughout this entire 6-year conflict. And that's sort of exactly what it seems to me that Stavridis is proposing. Abiy Ahmed has largely lost. There needs to be negotiation between absolutely needs to be negotiation between Abiy Ahmed and Abiy Ahmed and the Tigrayans. But the idea that the U.S. could come in and just sort of freeze things and instantiate a sort of stasis, yeah, like that'll work the same way it's worked in Yemen. It'll work to keep the conflict going, and that's a terrible idea. But something even more chilling struck me as a possibility. To be clear, Abiy Ahmed, while I think the U.S. government has done a fairly good job of condemning Abiy Ahmed's actions over the past year, this is the Ethiopian prime minister, there is a real natural affinity between Abiy Ahmed and his project and U.S. interests. He's a guy who wants to privatize Ethiopian business. He's a guy who, his project is unfortunately failed project. It strikes me as a noble one, though as I learn more and more about the intricacies of Ethiopia, its history and government, I think it was probably kind of insane. But was a noble project. Ethiopia, when Abiy Ahmed was put into power, was a place organized by ethnicity, by sort of different ethnic political groups, the TPLF, the Oromo group, the Amhara group, these militias that had banded together to form the government in 1991, though really the Tigrayans were sort of in charge. This is kind of grim, from a U.S. perspective. Like, oh gosh, so it's like ethnic-based government. That doesn't look good. And what Abiy Ahmed had sort of proposed was not just neoliberalism, privatization, U.S. pro-business orientation, but to do away with that old sort of ethnic-based government and have popular parties. He's got the Prosperity Party. I mean, it's like honestly, like looking from the outside and knowing nothing about Ethiopian history or government, that seems like a noble goal. So there are some natural affinities between Abiy Ahmed and the United States government. And even if the U.S. government intervened and got in here to nominally to just stop the fighting and bring about a ceasefire, being completely neutral, I think naturally it would end up favoring Abiy Ahmed and the Ethiopian central government. You have pretty strong evidence for that proposition. It was, in fact, the only now that, and it's not just Stavridis' article, the U.S. government is only flipping out about this year-long conflict in Ethiopia now that the Tigrayans are marching on the capital, now that it looks like a U.S. ally is going to fall. The pitch of tension and fear in the United States is much higher than it was when, oh yeah, there's probably a genocide going on in Ethiopia. So no matter how even-handed the U.S. might pretend to be if it were to get involved, I think it would end up largely backing Abiy Ahmed and largely being on his side. And this is the truly horrifying prospect to me. Is one of the reasons Abiy Ahmed was so attractive to the United States is because ever since 1974 and the fall of Haile Selassie, I'm sure I mispronounced that, I apologize. Ever since the fall of the old school Ethiopian empire, the Solomonic dynasty in 1974, Ethiopia has been governed by some flavor of nominal communist. Different periods, different flavors, different theories, ideological approaches, and yes, these the TPLF, I believe, was initially the TPLF. This is the sort of going back in the 70s, was founded, I believe, by Marxist students, and yes, so like it was the TPLF and the EP, whatever the Eritrean militia were. I think both of those were at their roots, socialist or Marxist militias that then overthrew a full-blown Soviet-supported communist dictatorship. But really, so there's been massive wars and transitions, but since 1974, Ethiopia has been governed with a nominal communist approach or nominal socialist approach. And Abiy Ahmed very much promised a change to that. So that's a really simple, really stupid fucking story that you could sell in the United States to a really broad range of folks. All you have to do to justify U.S. action in Latin America to a certain large subset of folks is to go like, oh, Venezuela's communist. And that's all you have to do to justify starving that country to death. So I was just like, wow, I was like, holy crap. You could totally see the U.S. intervening, supposedly to be even-handed, and then ended up just sort of backing Abiy Ahmed to the hilt. And then the Tigrayans going to the Chinese for aid. So sort of setting up a Yemen situation where the U.S. is backing Abiy Ahmed, like the Saudis are, backing this nominal Yemeni government, to the tune of billions and billions of dollars, where Iran bogs down that Saudi government, or China could bog down the U.S. government in Ethiopia for the cost of tens of millions to the tens of billions that we're spending. That was just like a really grim possibility. Something that I've thought a lot about is the Chinese seem to have not sort of risen to the bait of Cold War proxy war stuff that the U.S. would love to do yet. I think that Myanmar was a really great potential place to do that, and the U.S. is like, can we do this? Can we do this? And the Chinese are just like, no, we don't want to do this. We don't want to destabilize someplace. But it was so there's really if you're a student of the Cold War, which I'm rapidly becoming, and a lot of this conversation about there being a new Cold War is just kind of ridiculous. It's trade disputes and an arms race, sure. An arms race where the U.S. has 10 to 20 times as many nuclear weapons. Anyway, but there's no proxy warring, and it's sort of a way that the new Cold War could sort of remain harmless. It's where are China and the U.S. backing different sides? And that's one of the really horrifying realizations I had, is that actually Ethiopia could be perfect. It could be a perfect Cold War venue. Ethiopia, one of the proudest, most independent, and for the past 30 years, one of the more successful African countries, could potentially be. You can totally see the outlines of how Ethiopia could be driven into this very 20th century, nightmarish, Vietnam-style proxy war between China and the United States. So many stupid things have to happen for it to get to that point. So I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm not saying that's what's likely to happen. But looking at that, for the first time, I'm like, oh God, this is such a fertile potential, such a fertile possibility for a real gross killing millions Vietnam-style proxy war in the new Cold War between the United States and China. So many stupid things have to happen before that can happen. But I think one of the first steps in bringing about a horrifically stupid future like that would be this Bloomberg op-ed written by Admiral James Stavridis, just trying to open the door towards the idea that the U.S. could get militarily involved in Ethiopia. All right, I think that's a good place to stop the presentation. I think that's everything I have to say about Ethiopia and James Stavridis. I have a lot more to say about Ethiopia. I think I've got some produced videos upcoming, but that's everything I have to say right now. So for the next hour and 5 minutes, I will be doing... for the next hour and 5 minutes, I will interact with the live chat. What do folks have to say? Man, I'm doing this live on TikTok as well, at More Freedom Foundation on TikTok, if you'd like to join me on TikTok. And there are 0 people paying attention. There were some questions on there that I will. Oh, there were a lot of people who were there, or 3 or 4 people, but there are 63 people on here. So, what are your questions? What's going on? Oh man, there seems like there's a lot of contention going on here. What's going on? Let's see. Okay, do we have questions? I think there's like a minute. Maybe with the obs, there's like a longer. Oh dear, my phone is getting warm. It seems like there is more like a minute delay here. So do we have questions? Will Egypt intervene in Ethiopia? That is a phenomenal question. That I think is a really important and sort of terrifying prospect. I made a video earlier sort of laughing about the idea that there is a real chance of Egypt invading Ethiopia because of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. If you folks aren't familiar with it, there is a very large dam that's weird. I'm ending my live video on TikTok, sorry. There is a very large dam that Ethiopia has been building, and the question is if it fills it immediately, it could actually send both Sudan and Egypt into famine, could basically dry up the Nile River. I don't think that's going to happen. There's been a lot of fevered speculation for years now that Ethiopia and Egypt would go to war over this, that perhaps Egypt would bomb the dam. I have laughed about this for years. I think I made a very dismissive video about it, 3 or 4 months back. I do have to say that, yeah, like in the context of, I still don't believe that an Egyptian attack or invasion of Ethiopia is likely. But is it more possible now? Absolutely. I think it is much more possible. I think it is much more conceivable that Egypt would get involved in Ethiopia because because the Ethiopian government is so much weaker. A year ago, Ethiopian government was the darling, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. The guy, Abiy Ahmed, was the guy who made peace with Eritrea. He's the guy who wanted to privatize. He was the guy who wanted to bring real democracy to Ethiopia. He was, that's who he was a year ago. Now he's like maybe genocidal. Certainly someone the U.S. is considering sanctioning. Deeply embarrassing. Yeah. So it's a very different kind of world now. So I still don't think Egypt, certainly not a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia, a bombing. Yeah, I think it's a possibility. I don't think it's a likelihood yet, but I think the longer this war goes on and the more that Abiy Ahmed shreds his international reputation, I think, yes, the more likely it is that Egypt takes some military action against Ethiopia. Now, again, not saying it's likely, but I do think it's becoming more likely. Do you think, that's a really good question. Do you think the UN or the African Union should act in any peacekeeping? I think it's really daunting, a really daunting prospect. If you could actually get the UN Security Council to endorse a action in Ethiopia that the Chinese and the Russians were on board with, then yeah, I would support it, and I would even support U.S. involvement in it. But I don't think you could, and I don't think after the Libya experience, where the U.S. lobbied very hard for and got the U.S. experience the Libya experience where the U.S. lobbied very hard for and got a UN resolution allowing them to stop a humanitarian disaster. But in that resolution, in the words of the resolution, they said, whatever you do, don't overthrow Gaddafi, because that was Russia and China's agreement. And then the U.S. went and overthrew Gaddafi. So I just don't, Whereas I don't think the Russia or China are that invested actually in Abiy Ahmed or the Tigrayans. I just don't think they would trust the U.S. government enough to give them a resolution, to give us a give to allow a UN Security Council resolution to go forward, and they shouldn't trust the U.S. enough to do that. So yeah, like if there was some, I mean, I'm not aware of the complexities. I'm not aware of the the diplomatic nuance and minutia of what a potential intervention in Ethiopia could be. Maybe there are positive things that a UN force could do or an African Union force could do. I certainly don't see them laid out in this Stavridis article. Yeah, I mean, like maybe like you could have not even armed drones, just drones just overflying Tigray and Amhara, naming and shaming human rights violations. It's a really key part of, Abiy Ahmed at the beginning and now even possibly the Tigrayans. The winner doesn't want people to see the horrific things that they're doing as they are winning. I think maybe there's I certainly think it'd be great, to have some kind of drone overflight stuff, even without a UN Security Council resolution. What I object to is the idea of the U.S. somehow imposing a ceasefire, or inserting physical soldiers there, or even just bombing random people, depending on whatever ideas they come up with of what the conflict should be. If we're talking about just observing, yeah, we should put some U.S. And honestly, I would kind of hope we already have U.S. drones observing what's going on there. But as far as actual participation in the conflict, even in a peacekeeping capacity, I don't think that's such a good idea. I just don't even know how it would be possible. I mean, this is a real. The United Nations has been around for a very long time, and it has had peacekeeping efforts for a very long time as well. And how exactly would you put, so in the 80s, when I think United Nations peacekeeping was a much more active thing, I don't think there was any mention or possibility of putting the United Nations in between the Iran-Iraq war. This is a conflict potentially on the scale of that conflict. So I don't really see, and famously, I've been reading a lot about Rwanda recently, because of that sort of video, half-heartedly defending Noam Chomsky, I'd sort of dived in a lot on Yugoslavia recently. The reticence of UN peacekeepers and the United Nations more generally to put its people in harm's way is pretty striking, and those are in really comparatively tiny, minuscule conflicts. So it's kind of hard to see, like maybe the United Nations does a Security Council resolution that's sort of like, okay, and the U.S. military can go do whatever it wants. I'm not sure I would want that either, frankly. I think the African Union has an envoy, the old Nigerian president, who's attempting to make a deal between Ethiopia and the Tigrayans. I think that the U.S. government should do everything in its power, and then hopefully develop new diplomatic powers to support that African Union initiative, and try to get Abiy Ahmed and the Tigrayans at the table together to approach some kind of resolution. Absolutely, for sure. Let's see. Why doesn't Egypt invade Israel? Because Egypt is kind of like a, U.S.-Israeli client state at this point. Yeah, Egypt collaborates with Israel a lot. I think that's a question for like the 1960s or 1970s, not for the 2020s. Do you think the UN or the African Union is acting in any peacekeeping? Let's see. Sorry, I lost track here. This is a new software I'm dealing with. It's the theme of today. Are there any super chats? Does anybody want to? Are you having trouble with super chats? Oh, good, the super chat. Whew. Okay. Yeah, if folks do super chats, am more likely to answer those questions. The UAE is looking into funding Wagner soldiers for Abiy. Ugh. Though honestly, it would be kind of interesting to see what would happen to those Wagner soldiers. Like I like it is. This ain't Mali. You know, Ethiopia is not Mali. Where I think there's also some recent controversy over the Malian junta attempting to hire um, Wagner, Russian Wagner mercenaries. The Ethiopia is, and these regions of Ethiopia. I mean, Ethiopia is a tremendously diverse ecological place. You know, the geography is stunning and extraordinarily different and changeable and what have you. It's mountainous. It is extraordinarily difficult to deal with. It's like, you know, reading about it, it seems like it in some places it has like the worst aspects of, you know, Afghanistan and Vietnam combined in some ways. It is a place that is designed to chew up um, stupid outsiders who think that they'll be able to, you know, easily handle things. Famously, the Italians, and was it 1895 or 1896 at the Battle of Adwa, you know, Ethiopia was the place that remained unconquered until, you know, from 1935 to 1941. The Italians did manage to come back, but it was a largely uncolonized place. That has to do with the pride and the capabilities of its people, but it also has to do with the impenetrability of its geography. Yeah, I think that Wagner soldiers in a lot of conflicts are sort of game changer. You know, in Libya, you know, largely desert, a few cities to deal with. You know, that they were a huge impact on the Libyan conflict. I think, as I've been saying all stream long, I think Ethiopia is just a much more complicated problem than UAE or Wagner or the U.S. military has fully comprehended. I was reading, yeah, apparently the UAE has already been heavily supporting Abiy Ahmed, you know, the sort of drones that were meant to be, you know, that have been such game changers in you know, conflicts in Azerbaijan and Armenia. You know, such a huge game changer there. You know, were apparently briefly a game changer until the Tigrayans figured out their way around them and ended up winning. It's, you know, Abiy Ahmed has had these UAE drones, the Tigrayans figured out how to win anyway. So it's yeah. I mean, sure, would the Wagner soldiers, you know, be a key part of this conflict? Yeah, potentially. But I think the Tigrayans would find ways to defeat them as well. So yeah, Skylock says, any thoughts on Lebanon, the conflicting parties, Israel, U.S., Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia? I do not currently have any thoughts on Lebanon, other than what's happening there is extraordinarily sad. I think I did a live chat a while back, talking about how what's the word I'm looking for here? Did a live chat a while back talking about how U.S. sanctions have negatively impacted that situation. Not sanctions on Lebanon yet, but sanctions on Syria, and how the spillover into the Lebanese economy and just what a terrible thing that is. That I think is, you know, as far as I want to go with Lebanon right now. I've actually sort of signed up for an online class on Lebanon that I'll be taking, oh gosh, yeah, in the first couple weeks of December, and similar to a class I took on Tunisia, and I hope to be able to speak a lot more in a lot more detail and a lot more power on Lebanon after I take that class. though I suspect that I will just fall further into confusion because Lebanon is an extraordinarily complicated place with an extraordinarily complicated and grim history, despite only having a population of like, what, 5 to 7 million people? So, anyway. What do you think of this new era of weaponized migrants we're living in, says Angel Balanzar? Yeah, that's a weird one, man. Like, I think what Angel's talking about is the truly horrific, I mean, God, I overuse the word horrific, I apologize. But the just really just devious and nasty policies of the Belarus government at this point. Poland has distinguished itself throughout the refugee crisis era as a place that is pretty unwelcoming to migrants, which is rather grim. And Belarus has sort of decided to take advantage of this by flying people in industrial quantities out of Iraq into Belarus, and then literally throwing them at the border. Just simply refusing to offer them any services, tell them to walk towards the border. We have the Polish government refusing to be, unsurprisingly, not being particularly welcoming towards those migrants. Frontex, the European border agency, has offered to get involved. Poland has refused. Yeah, it's really grim. I think that what's interesting, though, is how quickly this issue can be, sort of solved and cut off. I think there's a lot of language around, a lot of assumptions that people make about, oh, Europe's going to get swamped, the migrant crisis is going to destroy them. Europe's so angry that the U.S. left Afghanistan because they think there's going to be a new wave of refugees. According to established international law, refugees are meant to be given asylum. That was an assumption that still survived around 2015, 2016. The aftermath of the European refugee crisis, not in any, I think it's probably formally established in national law in a few places, but I think supposedly settled international law still indicates that everyone has a right to seek asylum and refugees are meant to be treated well and . In practice, that's over. I think, and we're seeing this example again with the Belarus sort of weaponized migration thing. There's a couple weeks or a month when people figured out, well, what the hell is happening here? And then they figured out what was happening. They identified that Belarus was quite literally shipping migrants out of Iraq, and then busing them to the border with Poland. And so Belarus has lost the right to fly people out of Iraq. I don't know, maybe flights still continue, but there's now a great deal of scrutiny of people who might be flying from Iraq to Belarus. This is, we live in a potentially much more authoritarian world than folks who live in the developed world as citizens are aware of. And I think we are going to see that authoritarianism play out more and more, targeting groups who want to migrate. So yeah, I think the extent to which despite what the Rupert Murdoch's empire will tell you, Joe Biden has largely kept all of Trump's policies towards migration and asylum. The Europeans, with very few exceptions, are simply not interested in taking people anymore. And while there's certainly aspects of the European media who would love to talk about, those mean Polish people who won't let these poor Iraqis in, I think that's not actually how most European approaches are continuing. If the conflict expands to all ethnicities in Ethiopia, Neurosis asks, if the conflict expands to all ethnicities in Ethiopia, could the surrounding nations be destabilized, Somalia and South Sudan in particular? Absolutely, 100%. I mean, we're already seeing Ethiopia, Eritrea is already deeply involved in this conflict. That's something that's going on already. And yeah, Eritrea, of course, is a place that fought for its independence from Ethiopia. Was it in the 80s and 90s and won it? It's interesting. I read differing interpretations of this. Arguably, the Eritreans are majority Tigrayan, though maybe not. I don't dive into ethnicity. I've read differing interpretations. That's already a place that's being destabilized by this. But it's all what's interesting about, especially the countries that you mentioned, Somalia less so. But I mean, they're already such just deeply, deeply unhappy places. South Sudan, I believe, is still judged to have emerged from its horrific civil war. That was South Sudan, I think, was trading back and forth with Syria as the most lethal conflict of the 21st century. But no one was paying attention to it, unfortunately. Yeah, South Sudan, yes, but yeah, absolutely. I think is there potential that refugees from Ethiopia could somehow tip South Sudan back over into full-scale civil war? 100%. We saw that South Sudan is as well. It is a new country. It does have some conventional forces, but it is nowhere near as powerful or established as a entity, as a nation state, as Ethiopia is. Somalia famously is also fragmented and has ongoing insurgencies. So yeah, this adds trouble to it. What's very interesting actually is that, and I don't know about this at all, but this sort of struck me, is that one of the sort of horror scenarios was. The alliance between the U.S. and Ethiopia, its its hardest edge was U.S. funding and cooperation with Ethiopian military forces garrisoning Somalia. And when this war was launched in November of 2020, all of those Ethiopian forces left Somalia. I'd be very interested in seeing what the impact of that was, because I think the expectation at the time was that, oh God, Somalia could tip back over into horrific war without the Ethiopian forces garrisoning the place. I mean, is this another Afghanistan situation where the foreign occupiers leave and things get better in Somalia? I do know that there's an ongoing insurgency there, but was it made worse by the Ethiopians leaving, or was it improved? I have seen nothing on that. I should look into it a little myself. But Somalia, of course, the problem is, I would see would actually be that Somalia would consider one of the great wishes of Somali nationalism has always been to, I think, retake the Ogaden War. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing Ogaden, but it is the region of Ethiopia that is, I think, called Somaliland, right? Or it is, I think, in the current naming of that region, the sort of big tail of Ethiopia that sort of is surrounded by Somali lands. I mean, that is ethnically Somali. And I think there's a real possibility that Ethiopia, if Ethiopia fell into full-scale civil war, not only would Egypt feel like it had a freer hand around that dam, the various Somali polities could find another attempt to take the Ogaden, to take Ethiopian Somali territory. Maybe they could consider that a rallying or unifying cry. That's a potentially horrific set of events. So yeah, 100%. South Sudan and Somalia could be destabilized by this. To be clear, as I was just talking about, how Europe is getting more resistant to refugees and migrant flows. It's developed Europe that has gotten more resistant in that way. While there are a lot of serious states in Eastern Africa they don't have the wealth and the wealth, the options, and the geographical distance that Europe and the United States will have from this conflict. So yeah, you get a full-scale civil war in a country of 110 million. It can be destabilizing for everybody in Africa. I don't want to, I don't want to sell that short. I mean, that's 100% the case. Yeah, I mean, like, it's funny. The more I look at this, like, the more horrifying the potential results of this conflict become. The more it seems conceivable that. The more it seems conceivable that, what's the word I'm looking for? The more it seems conceivable that some kind of international intervention in this Ethiopian war is a good thing. But how can you trust the U.S. government to do that? And how can the UN Security Council, after these, these past decades of, yeah, I mean, Russia as well, but mostly the United States invading and destroying countries, how can this is a situation that would have been great for a functional and respected United Nations and international community to address in a serious way. But the United States primarily has destroyed any possibility of that over the past 20 years. So yeah, it's grim. It's grim. I meant to say I put a link in I meant to make this part of the presentation. I'm now remembering I put a link in the description. But yeah, I don't even know if this is going to show up anywhere. If there's a description anywhere, this is a disaster. But I do want to mention, as I think everyone should be aware of and should check out, the New York Times reporting over the weekend over the U.S. military cover-up of a slaughter of at least 70 women and children by U.S. bombs in Syria in 2018. It's important to emphasize that it's only when extraordinary resources are poured into looking into an incident that we have any idea what's happening with U.S. Air war. I think I fall in a little too much to calling it drone war, but it's it's not just drones; it's also fighter jets, ridiculously using sort of $100-200 million fighter jets to send $1 million bombs into some of the poorest and most miserable places on Earth. But yeah, U.S. air war, twice in the past couple months, the New York Times and other journalists have devoted the time and the effort necessary into finding out what has actually been happening with the war, with one of these strikes. And whenever the time is actually invested, we find incredible horror actively covered up by the U.S. government. This is multiple times now. The parting shot in Afghanistan that was so murderous is the other example I can think of. So yeah, it's real bad. It's real bad. Anyway, and people should talk more about that. So there. Vigerman asks, any updates on Afghanistan? What do you think the Taliban have done better or worse than the last Afghan government? I think that a lot of people were pointing towards the fact that there's still bombings in Afghanistan as some kind of like victory, as some kind of like indication of victory by, the Afghan government. Like, look, see the Taliban. The place isn't instantly at peace after 40 years of civil war when the Taliban came to power. And I think for the first 3 weeks, there were regularly pretty horrific mosque bombings every Friday. I believe Friday is sort of the most important day of the week for Muslim worship. And every Friday in some other portion of the country, there was reliably some horrific mosque bombing that was, I think, very clearly intended by ISIS-K and other groups to underline just how little power the Taliban had. Well, I think we're now to the point where we had a Friday with no mosque bombing, and then there was a mosque bombing last Friday, but it was much smaller. It does appear as if the Taliban is solidifying real control of the country, which means that the 40-year civil war is over. And that is something to be celebrated. Unfortunately, as we come into the winter months, Afghanistan has a really horrific prospect ahead of it, because it was the victim of U.S. imperialism for 20 years. The entire place has been organized around massive flows of aid, flows of money, flows of food coming from the outside. Keep in mind that the U.S. military the entire time was setting this place up as a dependent satellite. Because the U.S. military is now so terribly bad at this, it was a colossal failure that fell apart the second our forces left. Famously, the Afghan military, the Afghan Air Force that was built to only function with, kickbacks and American engineers. So the U.S. defense contractors would get kickbacks from the Afghan military for infinite future, let alone that, Afghanistan is still a place where people starve, but the Afghan military was set up by the U.S. government to constantly be paying U.S. contractors. Just filthy, filthy, disgusting stuff. Now that the U.S. has left and its occupation government has collapsed, you've still got an Afghan system that's incredibly dependent on outside resources. And not only is the U.S. Making those resources difficult to access through sanctions, we have appropriated Afghanistan's $10 billion central bank. So we haven't just cut off the sources of sustenance that the Afghan people desperately need. We have shut down economic activity within the country by kneecapping Afghanistan's central bank. So there's a real prospect of large-scale starvation in Afghanistan this winter. We are 100% actively penalizing the Afghan people for not loving us enough to keep the Taliban out of power. It's gross. But that's the U.S. government for you. This is, these are the happy, healthy people that we want to insert into the Ethiopia situation. Let's see. You think the rise of minority rights are leading to these trends? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Let's see. Not accepted. Yeah, not sure what's going on here. Okay, sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. Dexton Min, hey Robert, I want some good news. What are things we can look forward to in the future? For example, in technology, science, medicine, space, etc. Good news, yeah, I should definitely look for more good news. I actually founded this YouTube channel with an eye towards talking more about good news. Haven't been doing so much of that lately. Honestly, I think that the sort of the collapse of U.S. authority on so many different planes is actually kind of a good thing. I think that it's a series of wake-up calls. Our failure to do anything about COVID, like a developed country, our failure to react with anything like sanity to 9/11, I think that as much as I loathe Donald Trump, and as much as I dislike some of the things that Bernie Sanders wants to do, I think that the rise of them in U.S. politics is a great thing because it provides the potential for renewal. I mean, first you gotta, an old system has to crash before a new one can be born. And I'm certainly working towards the idea of a more sane U.S. hegemony. I'm not actually opposed to U.S. hegemony. I think actually, I think the fact that the U.S. has gone the world has gone 70 years without a great power war is a tremendous, tremendous gift. I think the problem, of course, is that to maintain that, you need a military threat of significant intimidation that the United States has, and having a military threat of significant intimidatory power that the U.S. has automatically yields stupid people who want to use that power. And of course, as we've seen, every use of that power, with minor exceptions, the 2 week intervention in Bosnia in the 90s, I'm sure a few other examples you can point to where the U.S. military force was used in a positive way, mostly in terms of hurricane relief, natural disaster relief seems to be the main positive thing that the U.S. Navy has done since I don't know, Midway. Yeah, I'm not someone who's against U.S. hegemony. I think that as the U.S. goes through this identity crisis and hopefully comes out saner and better at the end of this decade, it will yield a better, happier world. I mean, I am very optimistic. I think that what's so frustrating is that we have 95% of utopia. Our problems compared to the problems of any generation prior to ours are so minor. They're so tiny. In the U.S., the developed world, it's they're oh well, first generation that's worse off than generations before it. It's yeah, but all the money's there. If we just had we don't need to go socialist, we don't need to go communist. If we just had the general approach to fiscal policy that we had in 1965 in terms of taxing and redistribution, the United States would be a freaking paradise. There are a lot of really wealthy and highly invested people who are here to tell you that the United States can never have a sane or functioning healthcare system. It can. It totally can. Honestly, one of the most optimistic things I think over the past 30 years is actually, if you look at all the serious conflicts of the past 30 years in the post-Cold War era, almost all of them are because the U.S. government made really stupid fucking decisions, like invading Iraq, opening up a open space for jihadists to party in that was taken over by the Islamic State in Syria, overthrowing the popularly elected pro-Russia president of Ukraine. There are almost every mass death event of this century has been the result of the United States doing stupid shit. And if the United States just stops doing stupid shit, then the world could really be a phenomenally peaceful place. If it weren't for the United States doing such stupid shit, then what would, then the entire world could have focused on the horror in Myanmar, the Rohingya genocide. That's something that the U.S. doesn't have much responsibility for. Though, of course, democratizing Myanmar led directly to the genocide, but hey, let's not quibble. If the whole world wasn't distracted by the insane aggression of the United States and the disasters the United States had created, then the actual organic horrors that cropped up, if it weren't for Iraq and Syria and Yemen and all these other evil things that the United States has done, then the United Nations and the world could look at what's happening in Ethiopia and say, no, actually, yes, we should act as one to stop this, whether it's through some kind of targeted sanctions policy or some kind of actual, intervention. I mean, if you look at the Gulf War, that was I believe, UN-endorsed situation where the U.S. government took the lead and stopped a bad thing. It's obviously very different, very distinct from the U.S. from the Ethiopian situation, because while the Eritreans have functionally invaded Ethiopia, It still is internal, and I do believe sovereignty to be very important. But like, if you look at like 1990, before the United States, when the United States was still in that flash of post-Vietnam sanity, where we weren't looking to intervene anywhere, like the world was like, um, could act as one to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Well, obviously, with the U.S. taking the lead. Of course, the U.S. wasn't content with that and decided, instead of just what we could have done, we could have kicked Saddam out of Kuwait, given him a couple of years and be like, hey, like, we'll welcome you back into the community of nations. Just don't be an asshole again. Like, instead, the U.S. used that as an excuse to maintain this ever ramifying, ever growing involvement in the Middle East, which is completely pointless, and is actually a tremendous detriment to U.S. security. But hey, that's a different story. But what I'm saying is that what I'm trying to say is that, like, not everything in the world is the United States' fault. But as we hopefully see the United States begin to pull back, I'm surprised that we pulled it out of Afghanistan. I thought we were going to be in Afghanistan blowing up weddings for the rest of my life. We're not. We're out of that. I think that there's a distinct chance, once Biden makes his way past this interminable domestic agenda that never happens, he might actually satisfy a campaign promise, get back into the Iran deal. And if you got back into the Iran deal, there's really there's no justification for the U.S. military presence in the Middle East. And I think it'd be easier to pull out of Iraq and Syria. I mean, unfortunately, we'll probably, the defense contractors will keep us in Qatar and Kuwait and whatnot. But, we could really get out of the situations where the U.S. is actively keeping, bleeding ulcers open. I still have hopes that the Biden can do the right thing and stop the war in Yemen. If these things happen, then eventually, if the U.S. could spend 5 to 10 years not constantly destroying countries, that'd be nice. If we could do that, I think we could actually get back to a point where we have an international community, as we had in 1990, that could act in unity to stop a bad thing from happening. Things are so screwed up by the U.S. right now, not just in terms of the destruction, but also in terms of like the crappy little authoritarians in the Gulf that we've been funding. That like any conflict that happens now, and we certainly saw this in Syria and Libya, becomes this thing where like a bunch of outside actors are like, oh, I've got some agenda I care about, so I'm gonna just go here and fight. It's just this sort of like fractal proxy bullshit that makes it impossible for the international community to accomplish anything. So I think if the U.S. is finally in sort of like, if we do get like a Afghanistan syndrome where like the U.S. is finally a little chastened again, I think we have the potential of a much more peaceful, safer world with an international community that has the capability to look at something like what's happening in Ethiopia and stop it. But the U.S. needs to pull much, much further back. I think it is incredibly hopeful that the U.S. got out of Afghanistan. I think maybe the next thing we should be focusing on is the U.S.'s insane sanctions policy. Sanctions are potentially a useful tool, but you actually have to be able to lift sanctions occasionally when people do what you want. That's a very long tangent, and I think I have. But okay, so Dexterman, also in terms of like technology, science, medicine, space. I mean, space is phenomenal, the progress we've seen. I think a lot of people love to make fun of SpaceX. I'm a huge Elon Musk fan. This channel still exists because of Elon Musk, actually. You might have noticed it's not the most successful, but because I bought a few shares of Tesla stock 10 years ago, I am able to keep doing this. So just by way of saying that I'm very biased in favor of Elon Musk, but I think any rational person looking at SpaceX and what it has managed to accomplish in one of the most hidebound, corrupt, and expensive industries on Earth, the U.S. sort of government aerospace aspect. I mean, just what Elon Musk has shown is possible in terms of like cutting through the endless crap. I mean, like NASA and U.S. aerospace, sort of U.S. Space stuff is almost as idiotic and disgustingly corrupt as U.S. defense contracting. And Elon Musk just, people kept laughing at him as he completely revolutionized the entire area. And like it's really nice to see that something is possible like that. The progress on wind and solar makes it pretty obvious to me that all we need to do is have a decade for battery technology cost falls like we had for solar energy cost falls in the 2010s. And the climate change problem, obviously, there's tremendous, we probably need a carbon tax. We probably need a number of other things. There are tremendous shifts that need to be made. But I think that it's entirely, I've seen some articles, this is so scientifically fraught and theoretical, but it seems, I've seen some people that I trust say that actually, with the progress we've made over the 5 years since the Paris Agreement, the truly catastrophic results of climate change seem to no longer be on the table. What we've still got, I think so. I think the goal of the Paris Climate Accords supposedly are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. With our current policies, that is impossible. That's not going to happen. If you limited it to 1.5 degrees, you'd have what we have now, which is some storms that are a little more extreme than you like, some heat waves that are a little more extreme than you like, maybe a few more fires, but like no runaway societal collapse. There's certain islands that are going to just be fucked anyway. That's terrible. At 2.5 degrees, you have serious dislocation across the developing world, serious problems, serious migration flows. At 3.5 degrees, you have like serious catastrophes, like developed world countries start getting shaky. At 4.5 degrees, well, like I think it's something like coastal. This is 4.5 degrees of warming. Apparently, like most coastal civilization has to move inland. Tremendous dislocations across the entire world. Potential of like runaway climate effects. The worst catastrophes you imagine. Life becomes unlivable. Da, da, da. So I think according to people that I do think are likely, I think according to our current policies and current pledges, that's key. Well, are people actually going to meet these pledges? 4.5 degrees of warming, which was where we were likely, with business as usual, circa 2010, 4.5 degrees of warming was likely. It seems like we've now gone, like 4.5 is no longer possible. 3.5 seems unlikely. It seems like we've gone from, the likely 4.5 degrees of warming down to 2.5 degrees of warming. This is all incredibly theoretical. Nobody has any this is like the balance of statistical wankery of like some scientific people. And I know nothing about this, but like I think that's something to be very optimistic about. So I think that's like it's so many, like we really are at just sort of like 95% of utopia. Like the rise in literacy, if the U.S. can just be like can be convinced again to respect the basic sovereignty of countries, like because it's really only the U.S. that is still screwing with that anymore. Like we largely like conquest and invasion is like not a tool of statecraft that is acceptable by anybody anymore. It just isn't, except for the United States. If the United States can just stop doing that, like we're really in like a degree of stasis and like settled, like just having borders settled is a tremendous like evolutionary leap over all of human history. Just having borders settled, just being like, yeah, generally, you're not gonna, which is why actually, like, I go back and forth on this. Like, the US, like, kicking Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, if we had done that and then left and gone back and said that we've established this principle, you don't invade places. If we'd just done that, I mean, my God, we would be living in a kind of utopia. And we're so close to it. We're just like 95% of the way there. And so I am optimistic, and I should talk about that more. Thank you, Dexterman. Ahmed Dahari asks, oh gosh, sorry, so many. I've missed a lot of these. I apologize. Okay, Ahmed Dahari says, is the Chinese control of the rare material mines, which is crucial in electronics, in Africa is threatening the U.S. tech. I don't think so. No, I think that a lot of this resource stuff is bullshit, frankly. I mean, my one of my main successes as a YouTube channel has been pointing out that with oil and gas, there's just infinitely more of it, and supplies are high, and actually we're going to stay lower for longer for a very long time. And I've been saying that since 2016, and I've been entirely right. Even today, with oil prices higher than they've been in 7 years, they're still lower than they were 8 years ago. You know, $80 a barrel, even in the context of like whatever devaluing of the dollar has happened in the ensuing 7 years, is still lower than the standard 90, 100, 110 dollars a barrel that the U.S. and world petroleum industry was accustomed to in the 2000s up until 2014. So yeah, like, and oil and gas is a uniquely sort of indispensable and universal commodity. And even that, we're at a point where technology seems to be squashing that. A lot of the talk about rare earths, about lithium, ignores the fact that there are resources of rare earths and lithium all over the world. China has certainly invested in some stuff around the world, but you know, they've invested it so that they can be developed and sold. Like it's not like they're going to be able to, you know, hold these things forever. In the context of, say, a conflict with China, you know, where we had to get rare earths, there are 100% rare earth supplies that are available in throughout the Americas. There are lithium supplies that are available throughout the Americas. I think people are absolutely right that in the context of peacetime and regular development, these rare earth and lithium sources could take 2 years, 5 years, to get all the financing together, to get the technology together, to get the infrastructure together. Yeah, they can take 2 to 5 years to develop, and oh gosh. This is also something that applies to the farcical idea that, oh my God, there's a semiconductor company in Taiwan, so we have to, you know, go into World War III because of it. Because yeah, like building a semiconductor company, developing a resource of rare earths or lithium in the Americas, in the normal conduct of normal business, it takes 2 to 5 years to do that sort of thing. In the context of an actual war between the U.S. and China, or a blockade, or a more advanced situation of you know, a more further advanced Cold War situation where China tried to take advantage of that, you know, power over those rare earth resources from China. In the context of that, I think it would take 2 weeks for the United States to develop one of these resources in the Americas. I think we saw, even with a president that had very little priority towards fighting COVID, a process that usually took decades, approving these magical new vaccines, happened with a blink of the eye without an executive that actually cared about that. In the context of an actual war or serious geopolitical conflict with China, the idea that they can, you know, have some special control over rare earths or lithium or Taiwan semiconductors is frankly farcical, and is the sort of excuse advanced by the technologically illiterate. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, there were other super chats, right? Angel Balanzar asks, "What do you think of Iran-Azerbaijan relations?" That's a really, really interesting question. I think it surprises a lot of people who would sort of assume that, you know, so Armenia and Azerbaijan fight against each other. They both former Soviet republics that had a horrific civil war in the fall of 2020. A very serious conventional war between two tiny, tiny, tiny countries. Yeah, that's interesting. Absolutely. The war in Tigray, unquestionably, between Ethiopia and, you know, the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayan region, is indisputably a much, much bigger deal than the war between the two independent nations of Armenia and Azerbaijan. It was confusing to a lot of people during this conflict. Obviously, Turkey The Azeris are a Turkic people. Actually, the Azeri language and the Turkish language are very similar, mutually intelligible to a degree, like very similar. The two of those engaged together. Sorry, what I'm saying. So Turkey supported Azerbaijan. Armenia was supported really not by many people, mostly by an Armenian diaspora. And the Russians eventually, when it really looked like the Armenians were about to get just absolutely destroyed by the Azeris. But what was interesting is you'd sort of assume that, you know, Israel and Armenia have sort of a kind of solidarity as survivors of 20th century genocides. But they really don't. The Israelis were actually backing the Azeris. And the reason that the Azeris, the Azerbaijanis, were doing so well against Armenia was drones that they had purchased from Turkey and Israel. Azerbaijan, I think at one point, much of the Caucasus, I believe, was part of Persia prior to the 19th century. It's one of those situations where the Caucasus is one of those situations where a phenomenally, crazily diverse region was really hurt by the imposition of 19th century European ideas of nationalism. It seems like every Muslim country was run, from the borders of China to the borders of Morocco, was run by some variety of a Turkic ruler who spoke Persian and wrote it with an Arabic script. And in the Caucasus, it got even more crazy. What am I saying? So the Azerbaijan, Azeri Turks, the majority there, but apparently a lot of the population of Iran is made up of people that could plausibly be described as Azeri Turks. And that is a very serious problem for, what am I saying? And that is potentially, I think more in potentiality than in actuality, a very big problem for the Iranian government. And Israel potentially would like to use Azerbaijan to make the Azeri population of Iran a bigger problem for Azerbaijan. So what's interesting, there's actually a significant Armenian population as well as a significant Azeri population in Iran. And while the Iranians are, the Iranian Azeris are, I believe, Shia Muslims, the Armenians within Iran are Christians, and I think are, fairly well protected and well integrated part of the Iranian Islamic Republic, which is kind of weird. But because of this fear that Iran has of Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan's relationship with Israel, Iran finds itself more and more, especially now when the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan is in, I think right now, in serious contention. I think they said 13 people were killed yesterday in fighting. The Iranians are now finding themselves aligned with the Armenians, who are nominally a much more, Christian, and nominally a much more, Western affiliated group, but actually work closely with the Iranians. It's very complicated, and I hope I've done a somewhat decent job of describing it. Right, Ray Spy says, better than U.S.-Iran relations, which is true. Yoga Tonga, thank you for that super chat. Do you have a question, Yoga Tonga? I will look out for any further questions you might have. Yoga Tonga, could there be a conflict between Turkey and Iran over Azerbaijan? This certainly would help certain countries. I made a video, I think that's certainly a possibility, certainly something interesting, but certainly something that both the Turkish and Iranian governments are thinking about. But I made a video on the sort of fallout of the Azerbaijan-Armenia war in the fall of 2020 that I think is probably one of the more clever and useful videos I've made, because it's it talks about something that nobody wants to talk about. I think generally Russia is kind of a clown show. I think that they've certainly, Putin has certainly, for domestic political purposes, made it look like he's a big deal internationally, and because the U.S. defense industry likes that story too, it's gotten out there, despite the fact that I would say his policy in the Baltics, in Ukraine, Syria, even to an extent, has been kind of a catastrophic failure for Russia. In the Caucasus, and this Yoga Tonga, this is why I'm not really concerned about Turkey and Iran getting into a fight over Azerbaijan. I think in the Caucasus, Russia just won, like, completely. They're like three sort of post-Soviet regions of the world that were a part of the Soviet Union up until 1992. In the sort of the part of the East, in the East, focusing on China, I think Russia's losing there, bit by bit, decade by decade. Not dramatically, but Chinese influence will just naturally take more and more Russian power in that region away from Russia. In Europe, I would argue Russia has lost catastrophically. Its borders functionally were halfway through Germany when I was a kid, and now they're in the process of losing any potential of regaining Ukraine. They managed. Yeah, they managed to make it back to the Black Sea, yay! But like literally, when I was a grade schooler, they were, in more or less control of regions almost reaching to the Mediterranean, and the much of the Baltic Sea. They've lost catastrophically. In the center, in the Caucasus, Russia has won, and I think they basically reoccupied two Soviet republics. And it's fascinating that there's just no discussion of this. I think largely because the U.S. foreign policy community is just embarrassed by it, and doesn't want to admit the finality of the success, and doesn't want to send troops because actually they can't. I mean, there's no real. I mean, who would beg for U.S. troops at this point? Conceivably, Armenia. That was probably an opportunity to put in U.S. troops. I'm glad we passed it up. But like, I think the Caucasus, I could be proved horrifically wrong, because obviously it's a region in between Iran, Russia, and Turkey. But yeah, I could totally see that region being. I think geopolitical contention for that region is over. Russia has won. Russia, through South Ossetia and Abkhazia, has serious Russian troops, or at least Russian proxies, representative in Georgia, representative in Armenia, represented in Azerbaijan. Russia now garrisons the Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenian sort of quasi-autonomous region in Azerbaijan. Russia has occupied all three post-Soviet republics in the Caucasus. I think will act as a deterrent to any Turkish or Iranian competition in that region. And honestly, I think it's probably a good thing. Anyway, because the prospect of geopolitical competition, war, destruction, civil wars there has been, I think, largely shut down, because it is now pretty firmly in the Russian camp. A lot of people are like calling that a big victory for Erdogan. I do not think so. Okay, so that's that. There were some other super chats up. Wait, there were two. I want to make sure I got all the super chats. Sorry. Yoga Tonga and Zabalza did their own Azerbaijan relations. Fadel says, with Saif al-Islam, Haftar, Agil Salah having announced their bid for president, and the HNEC has rejected Saif's bid, they're likely to do the same to Haftar, leaving Salah. Wow, that's kind of crazy. To be the sole candidate. That's crazy. So what Fadel is talking about is the Libyan elections. The war in Libya is I guess it's technically no longer a war. The conflict, the disaster in Libya, launched in 2011 by the United States, is a tremendously big deal. It led to a lost economic decade for the entirety of North Africa. We now, led to the failure of the Tunisian democratic experiment. I have many hopes that that will revive, but after 10 years of pretty extreme neglect from the Europe and the United States, the Tunisian democratic experiment, the longest period of democratic control of an Arab government, I think, ever. Maybe there's some periods of Lebanon's history that would argue elsewhere, but I don't think so. Yeah, that experiment is now over as of July 25th, 2021. That is also a result of the NATO destruction of Libya. Just a huge disaster. Libya is potentially one of the wealthiest countries in North Africa. Gaddafi was an absolute nutball, but he also underpinned the beginnings of prosperity throughout the Sahel and North Africa, and the U.S. destruction of Gaddafi in particular, I don't care, but just the destruction of Libya as a functioning economic unit, it's been absolutely catastrophic. We do now have a period that could be described to some degree as peaceful in Libya since the essentially the Turkish rolling back of the attempt to take the whole country by a wannabe strongman, Khalifa Haftar. Haftar, of course, is one of the guys who wants to run for president of this country. So we have a peace process. We have the warring governments of East and West, with the West being controlling a lot more territory and a lot more people, and always having more international legitimacy is worth mentioning. But the dueling governments of the East and West had supposedly, at the beginning, in the spring of this year, agreed on a process for picking a president and a parliament. The president seems more likely to actually happen, an election within the next couple months. I think the parliamentary elections have been pushed off for a bit. So yeah, I'm always grateful for Fadel for always bringing my attention to Libya and discussing it because it is tremendously important. And we've got this interesting situation. We've got Saif al-Islam, who is the son of Gaddafi. There's a quite amusing New York Times profile of him. Prior to 2011, he was, the Western educated, business face of the Gaddafi regime. Now he's sort of rebranded himself as a, I don't know, sort of much more in the vein of his quite kooky father, to say the least. We've got Haftar, who is the failed strongman, actually helped Gaddafi come to power in the 60s. Haftar is pushing 80 years old, lived through, after failing in one of Gaddafi's wars. He was a dissident living in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, working for the CIA for decades, and washed up in Libya to attempt to set himself up as the last of the 1960s style dictators. Saif al-Islam and Haftar are apparently seem likely to both be barred from the process for election of president, which I think is probably a good thing. And now it just seems like Aguila Saleh, who's a sort of a what's the word I'm looking for here? Sort of a deal maker, sort of a fly in the ointment, the sort of leading light of the less legitimate Eastern Parliament that has been a problem for a while, might still be running. Anyway, it's I think cautious optimism is the appropriate approach to Libya because it is vitally important to Africa and to the world that that conflict ends. But I think also a high degree of suspicion that whether they'll be able to pull off a peaceful transition to the democratic system is also warranted. Do we have any more super chats? I think we've passed the 2-hour mark. Will Trump win in 2024? Man, it's funny. I can't say unequivocally yes or no. I would say that I was more in the aftermath of January 6th, in the first months of Biden's presidency. I was more likely to think, oh no, he's done, he's over. But now I think he's definitely going to run. And I think that if the US media continues to pretend, the US media, which absolutely did hate and work against Trump, continues to pretend that it's the pre-Trump era and they can just impose penalties on Biden for his very meager attempts to set up some kind of more social democratic, more redistributive system that could make people happier. It's interesting because the U.S. media absolutely hated Trump, but I think they hated Trump because he completely discredited the pro-war, socially liberal, Republican light approach to the world that the U.S. media prefers. The U.S. media loves the idea that it can be woke and never pay taxes, and get all its goods from Amazon, and that having no impact, and like it just believes that this sort of dream of the '90s and teens can continue forever with no consequences. And sort of Biden, I think, has a few older sort of FDR-ish, like old school, actual, like cares about workers, cares about the prosperity of all Americans instincts that he is failing to turn into government, largely because the US media isn't interested in that. Like Trump's gone, we need to go back, Trump's gone, Mitt Romney and Kristen Sinema are now like the media's ideal government, and that's just not going to work. Like if the media continues pushing that narrative, continues to think they're going to do that, and it's going to be a Republican blowout in 2022, and Trump would probably win in 2024. We got 3 years before 2024, so anything can happen. I think if COVID really does truly seem to be a thing of the past by the spring of 2022, then maybe, just maybe, and if Trump continues to be, the face of the Republican Party, then it's possible that like maybe the Democrats could like hold on to their tiny infinitesimal majority, but it seems pretty unlikely. So I think probably, Trump is more likely to be president in 2024 than Biden for sure. Is Trump more likely to be president in 2024 than any generic Democrat? Well, yeah, probably. But, who knows? Maybe there's some Democratic savior in the wings. Maybe The Rock will be the Democratic candidate. Who knows? A lot can happen before 2024. Would Trump beat Kamala Harris? Yes, 100%. Would Trump beat Pete Buttigieg? Probably. Would Trump beat Sherrod Brown, the famously old school pro-union senator, who could actually make from Ohio, who could actually make a serious a case that he cares about, actual Americans instead of like Netflix, a potential Netflix contract and what the Harvard alumni list thinks. Then that's a more of a real competition. Question is like, is the Democratic Party now just completely lost to like woke McKinsey consultants? Maybe. So I don't know. Race biases. Let's go, Brandon. That's funny. Which is apparently a key for fuck Biden. All right. Any more super chats? I think I should start pitching and dive. Thank you all to the 50 folks who are here. Thank you for showing up despite my screw ups with the new system. I have now figured out or pretended to be. There's another question. I'll get to that. I'll get to it right now. Comments on Central America, since most American refugees come from there, in regards to the Ortega election in Nicaragua. I have no plans for another Latin America video. Scott Locks is a huge advocate for me covering Latin America more often. Heck, I would like to cover Latin America more often. Spending more time in Puerto Rico recently. Yo quiero mejorar mi español. Yo necesito estudiar más. I need to study more Spanish. Eventually, I would like to talk more about it. I think probably I should dive in on Nicaragua. There's just so much history there that I don't know enough about. But what Scott is referring to specifically in Nicaragua, there are In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, the target, in fact, of one of the most concerted efforts to overthrow somebody in the 1980s by the U.S. government, which should be an indication of how helpful and useful it is when the U.S. intelligence community tries to overthrow somebody. Daniel Ortega, the erstwhile head of the Sandinistas, was out of power for about a decade or so, and has, I think, been in power in Nicaragua, first popularly elected, and now by progressively more and more fraudulent elections since 2005, I believe. You can correct me on that, Scott. He's recently come back to power through a truly fraudulent election. It seems like there may be some sanctions coming from the Biden administration. I am generally an opponent of broad-based sanctions. I think sanction any official of a foreign government as much as you want. I think that is very useful, leveraging U.S. control of the financial system to take away money from bad actors in, say, I think we've done that to the Chinese officials who are in charge of oppressing Xinjiang. We have, personal bans I'm all about, ban Ortega and his cronies, sanction them up the wazoo, what have you. But broad-based sanctions against Nicaragua, making a poor country poorer, contributing to food insecurity, I think is never a good idea. But yeah, I don't have particularly detailed thoughts on Ortega or Nicaragua, Scott. I need to learn more, do better. But thank you for the super chat. Okay, so I think I do want to do a little more live streaming. Folks seem to enjoy that. So maybe I'll do a second public live stream, but what I will always do is the patrons only live newscast. It's usually the first Saturday of the month, and it is for patrons only. It's for folks who have signed up on Patreon. You can find that on the YouTube home screen, the ability to sign up on Patreon. You get access to our Discord. Discord is it's sort of kind of like WhatsApp. It's sort of kind of like Zoom. Basically, I've really been enjoying it over the past couple months. It's basically a way for me to be constantly in contact with patrons. Patrons can make me aware of news that they care about as it's happening, and we all discuss issues together. We've got a special dedicated Israel-Palestine server on our Discord or section on our server that I've actually muted personally because I don't want to know anything else about it. People are discussing Israel-Palestine on there. People are discussing. We've got different other channels on the Discord server. I try to interact with it in depth at least once a day. It's a lot of fun. It's also fun to see other people on this in ongoing discussion. Our Discord we have for patrons only is a lot of fun. And we do the patrons only news chat where I basically do 12 to 15 items and I will do little mini preparations on stories. So like say Scott wanted me to talk about Nicaragua, then I would actually spend 20 minutes to a half hour researching Nicaragua to prepare for the patrons only news chat. It's a lot of fun. I deal with absolutely every comment because only about 5 to 10 people watch the patrons only news chat live. So I would suggest signing up for Patreon so you can get access to the Discord server and the monthly patrons only news chat where I try to do in-depth research on stuff that I don't know that much about, which can be fun and a little embarrassing, but only patrons see it, so it's okay. Also, I think this weekend I need to nail down exactly when, but this weekend we'll probably also do a Patreon. Not a Patreon. A patrons only, like a Discord Zoom chat, for lack of a better word. I don't prepare anything for that. It's just people chime in we did one of these last month. I thought it was really great. We had like 5-10 patrons chiming in from. We had Switzerland, we had Manchester, England, we had Idaho, we had Malaysia, we had Israel. We had just like 6 to 10 folks. We had Portland, just sort of chiming in from all over. And yeah, we just sort of shooting the shit basically. And I don't prepare anything for it. We discuss things, provide our viewpoints personally at length. It was fun to sort of actually get to meet people face to face digitally or what have you. So yeah, Patreon, that's fun. And you should sign up for that. What else was I gonna say? I now have a TikTok at More Freedom Foundation. I upload there every day. Usually just chopped up old YouTube videos, but occasionally I do some sort of TikTok native things, and that's kind of fun. You can follow me on Twitter at RoboLaw. RoboLaw Twitter. That's somewhere else. The conversation goes on all day long. Twitter's a great news source for me, sort of fun interaction with people who care about politics and whatnot. You can find me there at RoboLaw. I have a Instagram account at More Freedom Foundation that I try to use more often. I have written a number of books. I have written a number of books. I have written this somewhat complicated and boring, but actually quite enlightening thing called Fatka and the New Birth of American Empire that sort of indicates that a lot of the sort of Sturm und Drang, the sort of fire and fury of U.S. intervention is largely meaningless. What really matters is really boring stuff that attorneys and bureaucrats get up to that is really infinitely more powerful than any drone strike. This is less boring, but sort of basically explains all of the terrorism. It's everybody's lying about Islam. Explains all of this terror nonsense that we all cared about so much from 2001 to like roughly 2017, 2018, and how at the root of it is found the U.S.-Saudi relationship that hasn't really changed one iota since 9/11. This doorstop here is probably my proudest achievement. It is avoiding the British Empire. It is an attempt at a much more honest accounting of what the British Empire was. It was a lot more powerful than most people indicate. In fact, I think it's a much more direct analog for the U.S. empire we've been living under since, the 40s, if not the teens, than most people recognize. And I believe I have seen that the United States empire is making a lot of the same stupid decisions that the British Empire made that led to the world wars. It'd be nice if we didn't do that. This is a very long book, but I think it's also sort of like a stealth history of the world. I was very proud of this. I spent way too much time on it. But all of these are available on Amazon in paperback form and for the Kindle. I hope you will consider purchasing some of those. Any more super chats? Yes. We have from Jan. We have. What are your thoughts on Switzerland? I like Switzerland. I think Switzerland is a fascinating place. I think Switzerland and Scandinavia, despite being very different politically, with Scandinavian being more left-oriented and Switzerland theoretically, within the context of sort of European norms, being a little more right-leaning. I think they're all very similar because they are, Protestant countries with leadership. In some cases not, leadership that sort of forced everybody to learn to read 500 years ago. Switzerland and Scandinavia are probably some of the happiest and most well-organized places in Europe, if not the planet. Well, I guess, ranking up there with it's really the only places in Europe that rank up there in HDI with certain Asian countries, I would say. I like Switzerland. I've never visited. I've had great friends from Switzerland. One of the first, I think my roommate at the time, when I was putting together the FATCA video, and sort of when I made the decision to start doing this full time, was a Swiss guy. I like Switzerland. I think Switzerland's very interesting. I think, of course, Switzerland has its flaws, but even those flaws are just kind of boring and the beauty of a country with like Scandinavia, well, less so now, unfortunately, in Scandinavia and Switzerland, but I think we should all aspire to having politics as boring and bourgeois as Switzerland does. So, I don't know. Yeah, I like Switzerland. Christopher Murtaugh with a delightful closing super chat. that I can, it's not a question. I can do nothing but agree with. Loved that book. Better to read than a doorstop. That's a ringing endorsement, Chris. I should put that. Avoiding the British Empire. Better to read than a doorstop. Thank you all so much for participating. There is no more Freedom Foundation without this dedicated audience. It's become more and more clear to me in recent years as viral success has eluded me. It is phenomenal that I have a basis of people who show up and participate, and I'm tremendously grateful. Thank you all so much. I hope this will still be available. I have no idea how any of this works. There is an end stream button, though, and I'm about to push it. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Cool.